Record. Ready to go.
Okay. Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with David Dietrich and Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek. I'm Dave Dietrich.
I'm at the Oval Office for this one. I thought we were doing Second Inaugural Address. It'd just be germane to be located in the Oval Office. So excuse the flash of my furniture in the background.
I wouldn't want to have to dust that place. Man.
Our vacuum.
Yeah, that's true too. Okay, you want me to start over now?
No, we'll get going here.
All right. Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with Dave Dietrich and Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek. I'm Dave Dietrich. I am filling in for Donna Vitek, who is on scholarly hiatus. I'm a docent at a Thomas Jefferson historical site, as well as an amateur published historian. Mark Holacek holds a PhD in history and philosophy. He taught at the University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University at Camden, and Ohio University. He has written over 26 books on the life and times of Thomas Jefferson. Today's topic is Thomas Jefferson's second presidential inaugural address, which he delivered on 4 March 1805. In this address, Jefferson highlights the Constitution, the success and challenges of his first administration. So, Dr. Holacek, question number 1. What is your overall impression of this address?
You're going right into it today, huh? Just no fooling around here.
Well, we can back out a little bit.
Just saying you had a long day at Poplar Forest too, didn't you?
Yeah, well, it wasn't that long, a couple of hours, 3 hours. Decent people, good weather. It was hot in there.
It was hot.
The air conditioning didn't work and all the windows were open, so we got a sense of what it was like in 1810.
And don't forget about tomorrow. We're going tomorrow to retrace Jefferson's steps as he goes from Monticello to Poplar Forest. On the way, we're going to visit Randolph's place, where presumably it was at Snowden Plantation, 20 miles south. Anyway, that's cool. You wanted to know something about my overall impression, and that's a tough question for me because this being an inaugural address, Jefferson talks about so many different things. I mean, I'll answer this briefly, brachylogiously, in so far as to say, well, Jefferson is always a very eloquent person with his pen, and he covers so many different issues, and he does so neatly and so beautifully, and covering both domestic and foreign affairs, and begging the American public some toleration for lack of competency on his part, given not that he's an incompetent figure, but when he talks at the end, it's just such a demanding job, and no one person can get it all right. But he does have a wonderful, as we call it today, cabinet in place, perhaps one of the best functioning cabinets in the history of the presidency, with the people he has surrounded himself. So my overall impression is that he done a right good job in writing this one up. He's got as well as I do, his first term as presidency was abundantly successful. And he's riding the waves of that success in his second term. He was reelected overwhelmingly by a large margin. So he is happy that the American people have expressed their own view in their confidence in him by reelecting him. So, did I duck that question sufficiently well?
I thought it was good, and I like the way you tied in the first term. Good segue into the second term, obviously. And
I mean, you can't in the second term. As an inaugural address, you can't talk about the second term affairs that have yet to occur.
correct.
You have to talk about what he did in his first term. So,
And some of that, of course, was, there were discussions in the first term too. So it was something that was ongoing, you know. Anyway, and you mentioned that he won decisively in the second term, and I don't know how many folks out there realize just how incredibly razor thin his first victory as president was. I mean, it was like one vote, something like that. Now they didn't quite have the system that we have today, but it was really, really close. I mean,
well,
actually,
it was
Hamilton
worse than
pulled him
close.
out.
It was a tie.
Yeah, Hamilton pulled him out, basically, right?
Yeah, it was a tie, and the idea is that each delegate was supposed to give one vote for, say Jefferson, and the other for what we call his running mate, and then the last delegate, if who's going to vote for Republican, would cast one vote for Jefferson, then another for some random person. So Jefferson was supposed to win by one vote. It didn't turn out that way. Everybody, the same number of votes, both Republicans, Jefferson got, the Burr got, and it went through, I don't know how many different, had to go to the, not the Senate, the House of, went to the
Representatives?
House of Representatives. And it's something like, what, I don't remember, 26 or even more ballots. Finally, yep. You're right, Hamilton bailed him out in effect because not that Hamilton had any lost great love for Jefferson, but he hated Burr more. And, so finally Jefferson got the requisite sanction, I guess, or patronage from the House of Representatives, became president, and did a pretty good job in his first term.
Yeah. Now, is anything more to add on that one, Mark? Or you want to go to
not that I want to talk about, no. I mean,
oh, okay.
Generic question deserves I said a generic question deserves a very generic answer.
Yeah, I guess we can revisit that if we want to. Anyway, number 2, what does the address tell us about Jefferson's view on foreign policy?
Well, he sort of, I want to say strangely, turns immediately right to foreign policy when he talks of it, or offers up in the second paragraph a sort of apology for in the apology in the sense of defense, that on every occasion where he had to act as president, he'd acted to the best of his conscience and best of his abilities. And so he's not apologizing here, but he's defending his actions and trying to state that he's acted best. So he turns right to foreign affairs. He says, we have endeavored to cultivate the friendship of all nations, and especially of those with which we have the most important relations. We have done them justice on all occasions, favored where favor was lawful, and cherished mutual interests and intercourse on fair and equal terms. We've been firmly convinced, and we act on that conviction, that with nations as with individuals, our interests soundly calculated will ever be found inseparable from our moral duties, and history bears witness to the fact that a just nation is taken on its word when recourse is had to armaments in wars to bridle others. So he's given that he says somewhere in the opinion of the French treaties, he talks about the way you deal with nations, same way you deal with individuals. It's a moral relationship predominantly, and that's what he's affirming here, that you treat people justly and fairly and honestly. You treat nations the way you treat people, and nations will reciprocate if the nation is just, fair, and honest and stuff. And we, as well as I, that Jefferson had sort of high in the sky. I'm looking to see my dog sitting here while I'm doing this with a friend's dog. Jefferson had sort of pie in the sky views on foreign policy, where he didn't want to have favored nation policy with any nation. He wanted to have open, not only treaties, open commerce with all nations who wish to do so. And you put those two together and you deal honestly and fairly, and it's an impossible ideal, right? It's sort of like the Christian ideal of loving your neighbor as yourself or loving all people equally, the Kantian ideal as well, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, where you think about it, Freud's objection to that is not all people are worth loving equally. Not all people are worth loving. Jefferson wanted to have, in terms of his foreign policy, he says this in a number of places, open trade and exchange with all willing nations, and no favored policies, no favored trade status with nations. And you can't really do that because some nations treat you better than others and they expect favorable treatment in return. And if you don't give it, you're not going to get that favorable treatment in reply. And then when you do hook up with favored nation status with nations and they get into skirmishes or even wars with other nations, you reluctantly get embroiled in those affairs as well. If not directly in terms of going to war yourself, you become economically involved one way or another, right? And that happened, of course, when in Jefferson's second term with England. So he starts off with foreign policy. And does he say anything else about that's worth, that's very generic.
I sense that too. There's almost a certain level of naivete about the way international relations operate and commerce and treaties and so forth and so on among agreements among nations. There's an assumption there, and that is that if you behave and act nicely, other nations will reciprocate, and some may, but we know from the corpus of history that isn't always true.
No, it's not. I mean, there's great naivete. It's sort of, you might say, and I don't want to push this too much, but,
Sure.
Jesus was his role model. And, and in some senses, regardless of what other nations do to us, we have our obligations to be kindly, just, and fair to them, unless we're pushed into war or something like that. But he's got one thing in his pocket. He does have one ace in the hole, and that is the Atlantic Ocean.
Yes, right? Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Whatever we're doing here, we're doing, what is it, 3,000 miles across the ocean or something like that?
Yeah. Although ironically, that didn't really stop our enemy in the 1770s. Maybe it did ultimately, but
Yeah, but I mean, it's still, information had to travel across the ocean. It took time, if someone's going to war, England and France going to war. And we all know England had control of the seas with their great navy and their vast commerce through ships. And but nonetheless, and that's part of the James Madison's, not Madison's, Monroe's doctrine, right? Isolation from others. This is just Jefferson's policy. He actually asked Jefferson in the letter, they talked about that, and that's what Jefferson said, is just let's do our own thing and not worry about what they do. So I get involved in their affairs, which is not possible if you're going to have economic relationships with those nations and carry on trade. You can't not get involved in their political skirmishes and their quarrels. But I do think at the time we do really have to factor in the Atlantic Ocean, right? If we don't have a large navy, and he thought we don't have a large navy, so we're not going to get ourselves in trouble. It might be the British might take some of our sailors and stuff, but overall, we're not going to get in too much trouble because of the ocean. I think,
Yeah.
And now you're right to say it was a fairly naive view. Almost all scholars are in one voice of that. But Jefferson is Jefferson, and I respect him for that, for being honest. Sure. And another argument for me why he would not have had an affair with Sally Hemings, by the way, because he just, was honest and kindly disposed towards other people and things like that. And I just don't think that was in his DNA, by the way. You see this right here, the way he wants to behave with respect to other nations, stuff, almost naive in its sincerity and honesty.
Well, it's even today. I mean, we don't really follow the Jeffersonian view of foreign policy. I mean, to a degree we do. but I mean, there are other models out there too, but it's one of them that's considered from time to time, at least in certain elements of it. So it does have longevity in that sense, does it not?
Yeah,
Not
because
to the nth
honesty
degree, but
honesty has longevity. And, I'm a
yeah,
philosopher who studies the ancient virtue ethics theorists, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Aristotle, Plato, and I take them very seriously. That virtue is something real. That
sure.
stability of moral character is something real, and that it's something that's attainable. And for the Greek Stoics, and I think Greek and Roman Stoics, and I think Jefferson, whether he acknowledged it or not, was a Stoic. Um, it's just having perfect equanimity, and for the Stoics, having a completely truthful attitude with respect to all things, even one's own perceptions. Right? When you see
Mhm.
something, describe it the way it is. Don't describe it with any emotive uh, laden terminology. So having an honest perception of all things. And Jefferson did have that. And I say that's strange. This is a bit of an aside, but even when he describes people like Hamilton, and people you think that he would not like, Marshall and so forth, and you think, oh, Jefferson really hates these people. If you read him very carefully, his descriptions are not hateful. They're aiming at descriptive accuracy, and he's pointing out some of the flaws of these people, but he also points out some of their virtues in terms of uh, whether they're good speakers and so forth. So he always aims at, in my estimation, at descriptive accuracy, and that makes him a pretty much a Stoic.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I think he was, if not a Stoic, certainly profoundly influenced by Stoicism. Not to the nth degree, but to a large degree. Yeah, absolutely.
And Jesus, I mean, when you study and you write, when you've written as much as I've written on Jefferson's religious and ethical views, he really did at some point in his life hold Jesus up. And I struggled with this because I was so immersed in ancient virtuous thinking. Why does he dismiss that and elevate Jesus over the ancient moralists? And because Jesus embraced benevolence. So, what is benevolence? The ancient virtuous ethics theorists would always said, well, there was a return because if I behave virtuously, I have a return. Stability of soul, just like someone who runs every day said, why are you going to run? It's painful. Well, I have have bodily strength from running and eating well and so forth. It's painful, but in the end, it pays dividends. There's an internal reward. What Jefferson learned from Jesus is to do the right thing, irrespective of any return you can expect. Benevolence, beneficence, doing well, right? Without expectation of reward. Another argument for why he did not believe in life after death, heaven or hell. The right thing to do was eminently worth doing, whether you got rewarded or not. That's Plato in Republic, and Plato might have been wrong.
Okay, you ready for number three?
I guess so.
All right. What views does Jefferson espouse concerning the proper role of the federal government in domestic affairs?
Well, this is a good question because most of what he's writing here concerns domestic affairs. He gets rid of foreign affairs rather briefly. Um, he did have the problem with the Barbary pirates in Tripoli and so forth, and which was handled in. But here, his laissez-faire Jeffersonian republicanism comes mightily into play, right? Uh, he One of the first things he does is he gets rid of we have the midnight appointments, the Adams put in the judges, Federalist judges, and he's got to grapple with that problem. His fellow Republicans, the more ardent ones, are forcing him to work on that. He repeals the Alien Sedition Acts, which he considered to be unconstitutional. They were unconstitutional, but the argument sometimes you have to act unconstitutionally, preserve your own country. Of course, Hamilton would have said that. So he talks of you know, um, these contributions, talking about taxes, he repeals many of the taxes, like the whiskey tax. He doesn't really mention it here, I don't think, but and so he doesn't want the federal government to be run on taxation of citizens. He wants it to be import tariffs, tariffs on imports. That's where 90% of the revenue to run the government. So if you're going to run the government on import tariffs, you've got to thin the government considerably. You've got to get rid of its fat. And he does a lot to trim the fat and to eliminate needless offices. My goodness, if we ever thought about doing that today, right? Unbelievable.
Well, prior to that, was it 1912? I might be off on the date, but I think that's right, 1912. Most of the federal revenue did come from tariffs and things like that, and then we had the income tax, and that's our big one now. And my golly, I guess in a sense, we went from Jeffersonian views from the beginning of the Republic to 1912, and now we're in something else, aren't we?
Oh, I don't know what to say. I'm no expert on, economic factors, but of course we get taxed on everything. The income tax, you tax on your paycheck, you tax on. In Virginia, I've never had this before, a vehicular tax, where I get taxed on just possession of my vehicle because I own it. And it's, you ask yourself, and this is where Jefferson is entirely relevant today. What are these people in office really doing for us? We're paying them. And this is something, it's like an insurance policy. And no mean to pick on people who work in insurance, because it's a needed occupation, but you look at the amount of money you pay in, say, to your vehicle insurance over the years, tens and tens of thousands over decades, and then you look at how much you've gotten back on that investment. What? I've never gotten anything back. I've never had anything where I needed to get. So I'm thinking, here's an investment where you're asked to throw in tens and tens of thousands of dollars over the decades for a minimal return. And the federal government's sort of like that. It sort of has a life of its own, and the people at the federal level, in the House and the Senate, they sit and they argue. The Democrats, Republicans don't let any others play the game except those two. Play it seriously, and there's a lot of jockeying for power, and you wonder. I think Jefferson would be mightily incensed by all that. What are you doing for us? And I'm not picking on Dems or Republican. I'm picking on both. What are you doing for the people? Are you representing the interests of the people? And I think the answer is no. So he says, a just reparation among the states, paying back the states, and the corresponding amendment of the Constitution be applied in times of peace for rivers, canals, roads, arts, manufactures, education, and other great objects within each state. So he wants infrastructure. So he does believe federal money. He's not a states' rightist completely, in the sense that the federal government does need to intervene in those ways. He says it right here. Build rivers, canals, roads, arts, manufacturers, education. Why? There needs to be an infrastructure so the states can communicate. And the federal government can get involved here with any surplus funds they have to encourage that, right? But he doesn't mean to be interfering politically in states' affairs. So he says go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'll end. If you're finished, I'll say.
I was going to say, he says, in times of war, if injustice by ourselves or others must sometimes produce war, increased as the same revenue will be increased by population and consumption, right? And then he goes on to add, hopefully we'll be able to meet all the expenses of the year without encroaching on the rights of future generations by burdening them with the debts of the past. Here's his principle once again. He articulates it in the 1789 letter, James Madison: generational sovereignty. He doesn't want all debts must be paid within a generation. so that future generations are not burdened with the issues, right? Issues that may not even be relevant to future generations. A war that has ended, but whether that's, I think in spirit, I really like what he says with generational sovereignty. And this is something I've said a million times. Scholars, Jeffersonian historians don't take this seriously enough. This is a vital functioning principle of his political philosophy. Each generation must renew the Constitution insofar as it needs to be renewed in terms of new interests. Those interests are progressive, not relativistic, subjective relativistic, meaning anything goes. We need to change the Constitution insofar as we made new scientific discoveries and so forth, in terms of advancing culturally. So we don't want financial burdens on the new generation and any sorts of burdens in any way. I think it's people said Madison even said it's a very impractical principle. He may be right that it can't be put into put into practice perfectly well. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive for it, right?
Yeah.
And again, he says later on, again, this goes back to question 1, by the way. He talks about, your question 1 was about the overall impression. He says, going back down, he says, nor was it uninteresting to the world that an experiment should be fairly and fully made, whether freedom of discussion unaided by power is not sufficient for the propagation and protection of truth, whether a government conducting itself in the true spirit of its constitution with zeal and purity in doing no act which it would be unwilling the whole world should witness can be written down by falsehood and defamation. He says the experiment has been tried, you've witnessed, and it has succeeded. So he calls this, in some sense, the second revolution, the revolution of 1800. He's referring to it right at this point, that it has succeeded. In other words, we're getting away from Adamsian federalism, which it's sort of flimsy interpretation of the Constitution, back towards strict construction. And we're going to see Jefferson's not entirely consistent with strict construction. But that's, freedom. Can we have a liberal government? Can we have small government? Can we have a government that taxes its citizens very little because it doesn't do much more than conduct foreign affairs and protect their rights? So that doesn't cover. Where's your buddy? Did you get your buddy in?
One of the things that has intrigued me, looking at his comments regarding education, is it fair to say that what he was thinking in terms of the federal government is not the federal government roll up the sleeves and get deeply involved in education, managing it, hiring teachers, curricula, that kind of thing, but rather in the area of facilitation? Like what I'm thinking is, for example, the Northwest Territories, where you had so much land set aside for schools. Well, it wasn't the federal government that was going to build the school, as far as I understand. All it was doing was facilitating education by marking out territory for schools.
Yeah, and that's basically, you look at what he's talking about here, go back, he's talking about infrastructure, rivers, canal, roads, arts, education. Does he mean governmental money necessarily pumped into education? I don't think so. I think he's talking about basic infrastructure, encouraging education, not telling them what type of education. He hopes it's going to be liberal education. But, we need to have the infrastructure so that students can get to the schools, have access to the schools, and we need to have the federal government at least patronizing or sanctioning the schools in some measure, because education is important, right?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily the federal government. He says this in a number of places. When you let the government get involved in terms of promotion of education, it's going to not only get involved, it's going to tell you what manner of education should be had. And he says that's not the role of government. He's always leery of that.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We're under the 10-minute warning here. Let me go to 4. What does Jefferson have to say regarding the Louisiana Purchase?
Um, yeah, let's see if I can bring something up here. Share screen. You get a picture of the Louisiana Purchase, and we see that in effect we have doubled the size of America from the Purchase. There's an abundance of land to the west of the Mississippi, where we had problems trying to figure out what to do with the land east of the Appalachian Mountains. Now we have this purchase of land, and what does Jefferson say about that? I mean, I'm trying to find where he's talking about the, okay, Louisiana Purchase. Okay. He says, I know that the acquisition of Louisiana has been disapproved by some, disapproved, from a candid apprehension that the enlargement of our territory would endanger its union. Who can limit the extent to which the federative principle may operate effectively? The larger our association, the less it will be shaken by local passions. And in any view, is it not better that the opposite bank of the Mississippi be settled by our own brethren and children than by strangers of another family? Right? Very significant passage, very, very significant passage, because his concern here is one, the federative principle can operate. I'll get rid of the share screen. The federative principle, he thinks, can operate even better over greater land. Why? And this goes against what Montesquieu says at Jefferson's day. It goes against what Aristotle says, that democracies can only be so large before they implode. And the idea is, Jefferson said, and this is why he thought all ancient forms of government, we talked about this last time, were irrelevant. They did not understand the principle of representative government. That's the difference. Aristotle never got it. Plato never got it. And because of that, because of representative government, we can divide, as he says, and divide again. We can divide the country into states, the states into counties, the counties into wards, and wards having individual families. And each one is a government in and of itself. The family is a sort of government. A ward literally is a government. And you divide and divide again, and people get in the higher level at the county is supposed to stay out of the ward affairs. The state's supposed to stay out of county affairs, and the federal government stays out of the state's affairs. And so he's got this divide again policy. And his argument is that in a small government, if you get a strong enough faction, local faction, and if the government is small, that local faction can overthrow the government. But in a large body, large political entity, a local faction can cause little disturbance, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like, having a pimple on your forehead, as it were. It's not going to disrupt the whole system, because the system is quite large. So very, very important policy. And the other thing, as you know, about the Louisiana Purchase, the Easterners, who were in the majority, right, because of the population, the House of Representatives at least, were worried that the new states to be carved up are all going to be, because they're not seaport, they're not going to be manufacturing states. They're going to be agricultural states. They're going to side with the South and make the South. And there was talk of secession by some of the New England states, seceding from the Union. This is something they say only the South ever did. No, the Northerners said, let's secede because this is not right. Jefferson did this for reasons. He wants everybody to become agricultural and all this sort of stuff, and it's going to give all the power to the South. So enough on that.
Okay, final question. What are Jefferson's views concerning the duty of Americans in financial support of governmental activities, both federal and state?
I don't know if you have anything in mind. I don't. I just don't think he's talking about, if there's anything here you see about financial backing. I think what he's trying to do is eliminate that as much as possible. I think part of what, if you have something to say, please do, but part of what he's enjoining here, he's bidding citizens to do, is participate. Participation doesn't have to be financial. Financial should occur at the state level and so forth through internal taxes that are needed for the state. he's eliminating federal taxes on citizens as much as possible. And so we have the import duties. And in the first year, the federal government goes, I think, from, I think it's 93 or $88 billion in debt to 57. First 4 years is 57 million. Extraordinary amount of reduction of debt, right? And that's considering the Louisiana Purchase. Pretty cool stuff.
Phenomenal.
Yeah. Did you have anything in mind? Because
I think you hit it well. What I had in mind was essentially the same. That I think he thought there was a role to play for the average person in supporting the federal government and state financially, but there were constrictions to that, practical and real. So that, for example, you couldn't have a situation where unaccountable bureaucrats concoct some kind of witch's brew idea to create something, and then people get stuck with the bill. That there was a practical limit to that. Yes, the payer, the citizen is going to support education. That's going to require taxes and certain sacrifices, but it's going to be a very limited practical responsibility, not some fully bloated thing. And I think
you're talking about something. Your question is a little different than that. You're talking about something to the effect of the government imposing certain financial constraints on people, just in terms of forcing them to participate and give financially and work towards bloated government.
Yeah, and so he's not saying that there is no role for the average person to play in financially supporting even the federal government, of his time. What he's saying is that the top-down imposition, or however you want to describe it, that's not the way to handle things. Now, it may be now. That's a different discussion. But
no,
we're
it's
talking
not a different
about
discussion, because Jefferson would say it's never the right way for government to handle things. That's his view.
Yeah.
It always has to be bottom up. We might do it top down today.
Yeah.
Look at the troubles we get into.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, were Jefferson alive today and practicing the way he would, we probably would be mightily uninvolved in foreign affairs like the Ukraine war and things like that. It's a difficult issue to discuss in terms of non-involvement in the broils of other countries, simply because the world is a much smaller place than it was in Jefferson's day. And anytime you get the least bit economically tied to one country, there are political ties between countries, and you do get involved in the whole game. It's impossible not to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where the truth lies, but it is certainly an interesting contemplation.
It is, and that's another reason why I sort of disdain questions about what would Jefferson do today. And my answer is he's dead. He's dead. I mean, he would, like I said, he would practice science and he'd just leave politics, and either that, he'd go fishing or something. I don't have anything picked out next week. I guess maybe this is your call. Donna's going to be away for a while yet till she finishes her preparation for a test. So we'll have something at the end of this for our viewers to let them know what's going on next week. I'll let you pick something out.